Hi, this is Paul. We've treated some videos from Like Stories of Old, one of the more insightful film commenters. And on Twitter, a couple of days ago, he announced that he was working on a project that was, he felt more significant, more important, more massive than a lot of his other projects. And he just released, I don't know if it's the first in a series of videos, but I thought it was an excellent video and something worth paying attention to.
Now live.
Hang on. I'll be back around shortly. Do I really feel like we were connecting there?
When people talk about the marvelization of cinema, you probably already have some idea of what that means. The constant quipping, the annoying self-awareness, the fact that everything has to be a franchise now. But these criticisms alone never quite seem to get at the heart of the issue, because for every franchise we criticize there seems to be another one that we praise, and for every joke that we cringe at there is a similar one that does land. So what is the actual problem? What does it really mean when we talk about the marvelization of cinema? Well, in short, the problem, I think, has to do with a phenomenon called storytelling entropy, which is a term I made up in an attempt to offer a more unifying theory to explain, among other things, why you're no longer keeping up with Marvel like you used to, why you love some sequels but not all of them, where all these stupid jokes came from, why this worked and this didn't, and for that matter, why this didn't work either even though it definitely should have. And why so many grand productions with movie stars that you really like and with stories that have lots of potential nevertheless end up feeling completely hollow. This is the marvelization problem.
Now, I think that's an excellent framing of it. And storytelling entropy, it's the breaking down of what? And this is actually kind of a hard thing to get a handle on. We sense it, we see it exhibited in our behavior, you can see it exhibited in the box office, and he's trying to get a handle on something that we're experiencing but can't quite figure out how to articulate. I think he does an excellent job with it.
This video is brought to you by Mubi.
And we got the ad.
Let's consider the lightsaber. The lightsaber might just be the most famous movie object ever created, with a look and sound that most people on the planet will instantly recognize. And more than that, it's not just that people know what it is, there's a good chance they also know what it stands for. Because the lightsaber is not just a weapon, it's a metaphor. By virtue of its design alone, which suggests up-close and personal combat, yet with a dignified and elegant touch, it symbolically communicates a lot about the philosophy of its wielder, and about the larger world it exists in.
Elegant weapon, but a more civilized age.
It even has a clear color coding to signify, well, you know. The point is that the lightsaber condenses a multitude of meanings and ideas into a simple singular object. And as such, we can see it as an example of anti-entropic storytelling.
Okay, that's a great way, it's a great illustration, it's a great way of talking about the fact that we've talked about many times, that narrative is a compression engine. You take a world that's too big, we talk about combinatorial explosiveness with the work with John Vervaeke, and what narrative does is take all of this world with all of this complexity and all of these elements within it and breaks it down into something that we can engage in, something we can participate, something that we can process. This has been an issue for a long time. And in fact, it's a perennial issue with human beings because there's all of this that has to be managed and it somehow has to be put in its place. This from the book The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, How Great Books Shaped the Great Mind. And in it, the author, Jason M. Baxter, opens up the first chapter called The Lost Cathedral. Characteristically, medieval man was an organizer, a codifier, a man of system. His ideal could not be unfairly summed up, a place for everything and everything in its right place. Three things are typical for him. First, that a small minority of his cathedrals in which the design of the architecture was actually achieved. I am thinking of a thing like Salisbury. Second, the Summa of Thomas Aquinas. And thirdly, the Divine Comedy of Dante. All of these alike, we see the tranquil, I always have trouble saying that word. You can't fatigue it. Indefatigable, exultant energy of a passionately logical mind ordering a huge mass of heterogeneous details into unity. They desire unity and proportion, all the classical virtues just as keenly as the Greeks did, but they have a greater and more varied collection of things to fit in. In other words, the medieval world, contrary to sort of the idea of the Dark Ages, the medieval world was filled, but there was a way of sort of compressing it down into a unity. Now, this is very much the point that he makes about the good use of the lightsaber.
Anti-entropic because it renders disorder into order. It takes a plurality of story elements, unifies them, and then compresses them to their absolute essence.
Now the key here, of course, is that you want the story compressed, organized, ordered rightly in a way that it is both together, but then also all of the other parts fit in together. And as he rightly notes, the lightsaber does that in Star Wars. It organizes the story.
Consciously or unconsciously, we generally admire anti-entropic storytelling because it just adds so much richness to stories. And because it invokes the feeling that everything is meaningful, purposeful, and interconnected in a way that just makes sense. And though I've only been discussing one story element here, the same principle holds true for every aspect of storytelling. The characters, the plot, the world building, and so on. If you look at some of the most beloved movies ever made, you can clearly see this anti-entropic movement reflected in them. This intent to identify one core idea, and to then try and create the perfect encapsulation of this core idea by capturing it within every story element and every filmmaking technique, and by condensing it to its absolute essence.
So, in other words, good story has essence, and the essence permeates the rest of the elements of the story and brings it together so you have one story. That's what good story does, and he calls that anti-entropic. The story holds together, and the story basically is sort of a living whole. And as noted here, this was, as Baxter notes, this is the sense of the medieval. In the popular imagination, as C.S. Lewis joked more than once, the term Middle Ages evokes a misty blend of castles, knights, witch trials, torture devices, armor, superstitious peasants covered in dust, and maybe a dragon and a princess thrown into boot. Need it to be said, this was not how Lewis envisioned the time period. Rather, he pointed out that in all of his academic writings, the medieval period was not an age of primitive superstition, but one of bookish sophistication. And anyone who has wandered around a great old world cathedral like Salisbury Cathedral has some idea of what Lewis's comparison means. It is a paradoxical juxtaposition of astonishing variety, meticulous order, and saturations of light. On the other hand, both modern and medieval visitors are dazed by the height of the vault, the forest of ordered columns, the infinite variety of decorative motifs and side chapels and stones, while being impressed at the same time by the radiation of color as if light were dwelling in the living stones. In a phrase, this is what Lewis meant by finely ordered multiplicity. But in addition to these structures of literary, logical, and architectural order, the comedy, the Summa, and the Salisbury Cathedral, Lewis wanted to include one more work of art as typical of the medieval achievement. The medieval synthesis itself, the whole organization of their theology, science, and history into a single, complex, harmonious mental model of the universe. That's world-making, of course. In other words, what Lewis admired most was not simply this or that medieval belief or doctrine, but rather the whole way of viewing the world, the whole ensemble, the whole intellectual atmosphere of what I've called the long medieval age. And it was that which he, as the modern Boethius felt was vital to preserve, explain, and make intelligible, even within modernity. In short, Lewis perceived that for the medieval period, the natural world, like so many stained glass windows, as it were, transparent to a light from beyond this world, and this is going to be key with respect to like stories of old and what he gets at. What are for us merely natural processes seems to our ancestors phenomena that pointed beyond themselves. The whole world felt like a cosmic cathedral, and in many ways, good storytelling, good movie making feels like a cathedral. Now, I am just still dealing with a bit of jet lag, just back from Europe, and in my trip to Europe this time, I did have some time in England to see a number of cathedrals, spent some time in Oxford, saw a number of chapels, and you get into these buildings, and of course, Oxford has just this amazing diversity of gargoyles on the outside of all of these buildings, just building after building after building, and all of these chapels, and they all sort of hold together, yet they are filled with complexity and variety. But when you walk in, you don't have the sense of, let's say, a disordered room, even though everything isn't sort of, you don't have the sense that someone is ADHD there about all the little intricacies, but somehow they pull off what I think both like stories of old and what C.S. Lewis and Baxter is pointing out in his illustration.
$177 million at the box office definitely says yes. That's more money than the original movies made combined. This is the way. You forget about storytelling, forget about themes and meanings. Everything turns into content. Content that can be smashed together, rebranded, revived. Everyone is loving it. Money starts flowing in like never before. You learn to embrace the disorder, the outward expansion. What else is possible? Well, you will soon find out, because you're about to enter.
And he does a nice... Watch the whole thing. I mean, I'm tempted to just play the whole thing and do comments, but I also feel a little bad because you should definitely go and just watch the whole video, because it's a great video of talking, of sort of taking apart what's devolving in this space. So he sort of walks through that, and then he gets to... this is where I usually have my critique of his work, because I think he, in a sense, bottoms out. And he bottoms out because of his worldview. Because the only thing you have left, the source of this je ne sais quoi, the source of whatever it is that actually will produce the cathedral, which will produce the genius that pulls it all together, even though this is flowing through human beings, you need something. And of course, well, we've demythologized the muse, and so what we're left with is passion. But passion is too shallow a source for this. Passion, what tends to happen in the materialist worldview is that, well, you have the experience, and that's sort of all you have is the experience. And so one of the things to blame are, of course, the money-making corporations that will take Alien versus Predator and just run it and run it and run it until you get all the money out of it that you can, and in a sense destroying the franchise. Or, poor Harrison Ford in his 80s has to do one more Indiana Jones movie, and now we have AI, so we can make him look young, or we can have a computer-generated Harrison Ford to do these new things. And, poor Princess Leia, after the actor dies, gets to, continue to be in movies even afterwards. And, of course, part of this led to the actor striking, et cetera, et cetera. But passion is pretty much what he's left with.
And turned it into something trivial.
Now, I'm not an industry insider, and so I don't want to go too deeply into the broader industry developments that have undoubtedly been affecting how movies are made, such as the rise of streaming services and the decline of the movie star and the mid-budget production. But I do want to explore the more indirect effect that these developments have had on the actual storytelling in movies, even if this is based on more of an intuitive feeling rather than a factual observation. Not too long ago, I was watching The Rings of Power, the Amazon series based on The Lord of the Rings, and
And of course, he's going to trot out all the most glaring examples of it that we've seen. So basically, he pulled out the Lord of the Rings, and to what can we account this masterpiece that was the first trilogy of Lord of the Rings?
writing of the script, to scouting the locations, building sets, finding the cast, basically everything from beginning to end. And the one thing that always stood out to me was the sheer amount of passion that was just so palpable in everyone and everything. To the 12-year-old that I was, it made filmmaking look like a magical experience. And this may have just been projection, but I'd swear I could feel this passion shining through in the final product. It makes sense that passion is an anti-entropic force when it comes to storytelling, perhaps even one of the strongest ones. Because passion is what drives filmmakers and everyone involved in the filmmaking process to work with absolute commitment to condense their vision to that absolute state of perfection. And this is exactly what so often seems to be missing today. When you look at many of the bigger properties in recent years, it just feels like they're not initiated by this kind of creative passion, but rather by studios and producers that want to make certain movies or TV shows not because they're just yearning to tell these stories.
And so, again, it boils down to this passion, and exactly what this passion is in a materialist frame is difficult to say because, of course, matter is foundational and spirit is derivative. And so, well, it's lacking this passion, but where does this passion come from? Of course, older ancient worldviews would find sources beneath that, in fact, spirit is foundational and matter gets moved around by spirit. He's sort of trying to say that passion is what's moving this. He wants to have spirit move matter and have genius exhibited through passion, but the worldview is insufficient to actually hold this. Now, I was reading about the medieval mind of C.S. Lewis, and Baxter was talking about why Lewis and Tolkien looked to the Middle Ages, because they believed that, in fact, that's where that there was mastery there that could be learned. Now, what's interesting is that I think what he is noticing in modern storytelling is similar to what happened earlier just in writing. Lewis was actually part of a religious renaissance in the 1920s that was happening in Oxford. In 1930, the celebrity author Evelyn Waugh, whose novel, 1903 to 1966, whose novel Vile Bodies had been hailed earlier that year as the ultra-modern novel, dropped a bombshell in literary circles. He announced that he had become a Catholic. This development was so unexpected and significant that it immediately made the front pages of one of Britain's leading newspapers, the Daily Express. How, its editors wondered, could an author best known for his almost passionate adherence to the ultra-modern have embraced the Catholic faith? For the next week, the paper's columns were filled with comments and reflections on this unexpected and baffling development. Yet the cultural attention given to Waugh's conversion was only partly due to his celebrity status as a fashionable young author of best-selling satirical novels. Waugh was the latest in a long line of literary figures to embrace Catholicism, such as G.K. Chesterton, who converted in 1922, Graham Greene, who converted in 1926. Some began to wonder if a Christian literary renaissance was underway. Not all of the literary figures to convert to Christianity in this period in this brief yet intense period of Christian revival, adopted Catholicism. In 1927, T.S. Eliot, the best known for his poem The Waste Land, still widely acknowledged as one of the finest and most discussed poems of the 20th century, converted to Anglicanism. Although Eliot's conversion did not make quite the same newspaper headlines as Wa's, Eliot's huge reputation as a poet and literary critic ensured that his conversion was widely discussed and debated. Eliot found in Christianity a principle of order and stability located outside the human self, which allowed him a secure vantage point from which to engage the world. Some 4 or 5 years later, Lewis became a Christian, and of course Tolkien became Catholic. Lewis became a Christian. Like Eliot, he chose to become a member of the Church of England, yet nobody had ever heard of Lewis, and nobody paid any attention to this development, if they had noticed it at all. Lewis, it must be appreciated, was almost totally unknown in 1931. He had published 2 cycles of poems under the pseudonym Clive Hamilton. Neither had been critically or commercially successful. Lewis's rise to popular fame would not begin until 1940 with the publication of The Problem of Pain, which can now be seen as having to have set in motion a series of developments leading to his celebrity status as a wartime apologist. Even Evelyn Waugh drew attention to his religious faith in account of his fame as a novelist. Lewis's fame would be on the basis of the works that would eventually secure him popular acclaim. Nevertheless, Lewis fits into a broader pattern at this time. The conversion of literary scholars and writers through and because of their literary interest. Lewis's love of literature was not a backdrop to his conversion. It is integral to his discovery of the rational and imaginative appeal of Christianity. Lewis hints at this throughout Surprised by Joy. A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful in his reading. There are traps everywhere. Lewis's reading of the classics of English literature forced him to encounter and evaluate the idea and attitudes that they embodied and expressed, and to his chagrin, Lewis began to realize that those who were grounded in a Christian outlook seemed to offer the most resilient and persuasive treaty with reality. Many leading writers came to faith around the same time through reflecting on literary issues. For example, Graham Greene criticized modernist writers such as Virginia Woolf and E.M. Forster for creating characters who wandered like cardboard symbols through a world that was paper thin. There was, Greene argued, no sense of reality in their writing. To lose sight of the religious sense, as they had clearly done, was also to lose any sense of the importance of the human act. Great literature depends upon a passionate commitment to a real world, which, for Greene, demanded a foundation in a deeper order of things grounded in the nature and will of God. Evelyn Waugh made much the same point. Without God, an author could not give his characters reality and depth. You can only leave God out by making your characters pure abstractions. Good novels rested on a plausible account of human nature, which for Waugh, in turn, rested on the remarkable capacity of the Christian faith to make sense of the world in general and human nature in particular. It provided a lens which brought the distorted world around him into sharp focus, allowing him to understand it properly for the first time. Waugh spoke of his delight in discovering this new way of engaging reality in a letter in 1949. Conversion is like stepping across the chimney piece out of the looking-glass world, where everything is an absurd caricature, into the real world God made, and then begins the delicious process of exploring it limitlessly. Similar concerns seem to have played a role in catalyzing Lewis's growing interest in the Christian faith. In Surprised by Joy, Lewis comments on his discovery in the early 1920s of the surprising depth of literature shaped by and grounded in the Christian faith. Now remember, Lewis was always also eventually reaching back into the medieval to bring that into the present, as of course was Tolkien. And of course they would meet together as the Inklings and work on these very issues together. Modernist writers such as George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells seemed a little thin. There was no depth in them. They were too simple. The roughness and density of life was not adequately represented in their works. The Christian poet George Herbert, 1593 to 1633, in a marked contrast, seemed to Lewis to excel in conveying the very quality of life as we actually live it. Yet instead of doing it all directly, he insisted on mediating it through what Lewis then termed the Christian mythology. By the early 1920s, Lewis had yet to conclude that Christianity was true. He was, however, gradually coming to grasp its potential impact for an understanding of the world and the self. But he failed at that stage to appreciate the implications of the ludicrous contradiction between my theory of life and my actual experiences as a reader. Are we to see here a classic approach to the discovery of the divine, so memorably described by Blaise Pascal in the 17th century? For Pascal, there was little point in trying to persuade anyone of the truth of religious belief. The important thing, he argued, was to make people wish that it were true, having caught sight of the rich, satisfying vision of reality it offered. This is exactly what we see in great storytelling in movies. You wish Star Wars were true to the point that people adopt the Jedi religion. You wish The Lord of the Rings is true. You wish Harry Potter is true. You wish The Matrix is true. This is, in fact, the hallmark, and for you to enter into this universe. Once such a desire is implanted in the human heart, the human mind would eventually catch up with its deep intuitions. The poets George Herbert and Thomas Traherne did not persuade Lewis to believe in God. Rather, they led him to think that such a belief offered a rich and robust vision of human life, making him wonder whether there might, after all, be something to be said for their way of thinking. To piece together the story of Lewis's conversion is primarily to explore the developments of an internal world, which is unfortunately not available for public inspection. Clues to these developments abound, but they need to be woven together into a coherent whole. In what follows, we shall try to make sense of this complex yet fascinating story, and of course he's going to roll that out. I think what we're left here with is that you need a worldview that can actually account for what we're seeing. Now, obviously, I'm not making the statement that only Christians write good stories, because obviously with the movies, Christians have made some dramatically bad movies, usually because they are just trying to hammer a certain story down and basically use movies as propaganda. But the idea is that something is flowing through us. And it may be a good thing, it may be a bad thing, but something is flowing through us. The worldview that says, well, it just starts with human passion, I don't think that's really going to get where we want to go. I think I leave off where I picked up on this video about Chris Williamson and C.S. Lewis, where Chris Williamson talks about the fact that the way we're set up, we can't really achieve this happiness. And he walks through a whole variety of things. And then I pick up, again, Alistair McGrath's biography of C.S. Lewis with the argument from desire, in that where the movies leave us is the desire for another world. We want to walk into Star Wars. We want to walk into Lord of the Rings. We want to walk into these places, but we're left dissatisfied. I like the fact that he makes the point that stories have to end. And Lewis makes the point that where you have to arrive in this world is that this world is insufficient to actually satisfy our desire. This world can't quite get us there. Lewis notes that part of the desire which emerged in him as a child was not only to have the desires satisfied and fulfilled, but the aching of a desire that he knew would not be fulfilled. And both of those come together. So what is the ultimate object of desire, this intense longing? Lewis here anticipates his argument from desire, which is central to this Christian apologetic. He would develop further in his wartime radio broadcast a decade later, and subsequently collect together in Mere Christianity. Lewis opens up with a line of thought originally employed by French philosopher Blaise Pascal. Pascal is all over Lewis. Namely, that there's an abyss within the human soul, which is so great that only God can fill it. Or to change the imagery, there is a chair in the human soul awaiting some guest who has yet to arrive. If nature makes nothing in vain, the one who can sit in this chair must exist. Our experience of this desire both discloses our true identity and intimates our true goal. And I think good movies and good story actually do this. We experience this in those stories. We initially understand this desire as a yearning for something tangible within the world. Then we realize that nothing within the world is able to satisfy our desire. John the Pilgrim initially desires the island, yet he gradually comes to realize that this true longing is actually for the landlord. Lewis's way of referring to God. In other explanations, and proposed goal for this sense of yearning fails to satisfy intellectually or existentially. There are false objects of desire whose falsity is ultimately exposed by their failure to satisfy the deepest yearnings of our humanity. So often good movies will just leave us yearning for it, and that yearning we love and go back to again and again to even feel the absence of it once more. There is indeed a chair in the human soul, and its intended occupant is God. If man diligently follows this desire, pursuing the false objects within their falsity appeared, and then resolutely abandoned them, he must come out at last into the clear knowledge that the human soul was made to enjoy some object that is never fully given, nay, cannot even be imagined as given in our present mode of subjective and spatiotemporal experience. In the light of Lewis's more mature ways of thinking, one important point stands out as being particularly interesting. The Pilgrim's Regress actually describes two journeys, there and back again. Having realized the true significance of the island, the pilgrim now retraces his steps. When the pilgrim walks back through the same landscape after coming to faith, the regress of the book's title, he discovers that this appearance has changed. He sees it in a new way. His guide explains that he is seeing the land as it really is. Now, good movies and good storytelling will give you the same effect. After the experience of the storytelling, after the movie, you now see the world in a different way. Star Wars did that for a generation. Harry Potter did that for a generation. The Matrix did that generation. Now the world is different. Lewis here anticipates one of the leading themes of his later writings, that the Christian faith allows us to see things as they really are. There are strong hints here of some images in the New Testament, such as eyes being opened and veils being removed.
The key factor here, which is all too often forgotten, is knowing when this bigger story is completed, or for that matter, when any story or idea is completed. Great storytelling, anti-entropic storytelling, is about creation, continued creation. It's about making something beautiful and then doing it all over again from a new point of inception. Entropy is the opposite of that. It's the outward movement towards that slow death that's always just over the horizon. A purgatory of empty eyes and hollow beauty, of faded originals and crystal clear forgeries. It's the forgotten memory of what was once real, and what can be real again. But in order to achieve that, we have to be able to move on. We have to allow our stories to end.
What makes a story is something that flows through us. Now, we certainly participate in it, and we certainly experience it, and there's certainly talent. There's all of those things, but anybody who creates anything sits down, and one of the things that you notice as a preacher is that, well, some things fall flat. Some things you think will work and don't. Some things you know won't work, but then seem to. So it's something else that is happening. It is beyond us. It is through us. It is in us. And I think that's why these literary figures of the 1920s embraced faith and began to live in it, so that they would have a better connection of actually living in the story. Now, of course, the story does have a beginning, middle, and end, but then comes around again. And of course, that's what religion deals with. All of these cycles, all of this life getting closer and closer to the source of the story making, so that in fact our lives can participate in this desire even when it falls short, and finally reach towards that goal. So very much recommend this video. I think he did a terrific job in it. But to me, when I listened to it, it was just haunted for a metaphysic that actually doesn't bottom out the way culturally we are bottoming out. And I think part of what we're seeing now in terms of the rise of new Christian storytelling and the rise of people coming to faith is in fact a feeling of this bottoming out, and that desire driving us further in to say, surely there must be a bigger story that we are participating in. So I often hate to make a video about a piece of work that is so beautiful like the video essay that he put together, because my essay is nowhere near as beautiful. It's off the cuff. It's a work of process. It's trying to get a sense of it. But I do want you to watch his video, and I do want you to think about it. And I do want you to deal with what these English literary figures in the 1920s dealt with, which actually produced The Lord of the Rings, which would go on to produce some of the great works that we've enjoyed in the movies today. So leave a comment. Let me know what you think.